Welcome, friends, to Quest Rewind, Episode 2, where we continue our adventure and going back to the 90s and talking all about the Nintendo 64. On the previous episode, we focused on everything that happened before its launch, from the Ultra 64 to the very first time that people saw Super Mario 64 and had that reaction of, oh my goodness, from 2D to 3D, the prices, the situations happening with Sony, comparing the N64 and its games and the price points and all that, because I mean those cartridges were not cheap. So if you haven't, make sure to go back to the archive and check that episode out, because this one's going to be all about the launch of the Nintendo 64, which came out in North America on September 29th, 1996. So for this episode, it's going to be starring three lovely gamers, including yours truly, Juan Velez from Puerto Rico.
I'm Ryan from Boston.
And I'm Canadian Keith.
And Keith, I actually want to piggyback on the conversation we had on the previous episode about the whole fact that the N64 cartridges were $70. Now, you look at the console and it's $200 price point, and it's actually not bad, right? All things considered, but knowing that we pretty much got this massive lineup of games. We're talking about two games, and Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings. What did you think about that price point? And considering inevitably you have the one main game most people are going to get.
It was very much a one-trick show in the Nintendo 64 launch lineup, but something I just learned is that this was a Nintendo system that did not come with a pack-in game. So yes, even like in 1996 standards, the $200 price point is pretty good. But the fact that you had to add on that $60, $70 on top of it, you can't really call it a $200 console at that point. So when you compare that against something like the Nintendo or the Super Nintendo at launch, it's a pretty hard sell probably in 1996 terms. Like, yes, you had an amazing game sitting right there, and most of the conversation was, oh my god, you need to see this game. You need to try Super Mario 64. But it was something that you had to throw a little more money out to do so. And yeah, that must have been one of the first times in history that a Nintendo console did that, if not the first.
And I just wanted to say, like, you brought up a really interesting point, and I want to, after talking about this, I want to take it to Ryan. You mentioned it's like, here's the launch, price, but then there's always the pack-ins. In this case, you always want to get a game. And, just before this, we got the PS1, and this was the generation where, yeah, you have the game, you have the console, but hey, you got to fork over $40 and you got to get yourself a memory card. So it's an interesting strategy where companies will try to have the lowest price point possible, knowing that at the end of the day, you're not really spending that, right? Because with the N64, you can get up to 3 additional controllers.
Because once you get that memory card in Super Mario 64, really it's a $300 console at that point.
Absolutely. So yeah, Brian, in your case, like, talk to me about that. It's finally out, September 29th, 1996. 2 games, about $70 a pop. What do you think?
It's lucky that it had a very, very good game to come out with it, right? Because a 2-game launch is a little bit weak, and not even just a little bit weak, it's super weak. But when one of your 2 games is one of the greatest video games of all time that people still play very actively to this day, that definitely helps carry you through the next few months when you start to get more titles coming out. But luckily, Super Mario 64 was so good that it kept people busy. And of course, the other game being Pilot Wings is a fine game in and of itself. But let's be honest, everyone was talking about and playing Super Mario 64.
Yeah, Pilot Wings wasn't exactly setting the world on fire the way that Super Mario 64 was. I played it a little bit back in the day, but not all that much. Like, yeah, Pilot Wings kind of gets forgotten by its extremely successful older brother in Super Mario.
And by the way, so a lot of the things we'll be pulling articles from. I want to give a credit to businessinsider.com and nintendo64.fandom.com. So as I mentioned before, the launch date for North America was September 29th, 1996. Now, Japan got it a little bit before that on June 23rd of that same year. Now, I always thought as a kid, and this is why, once again, I love working on this podcast. It's like you're able to validate, like, Keith, thought differently about the launch lineup and all that. I was always under the impression, because Japan always gets so many games that we don't get, right? And I know it was still the case here, but apparently they only got one more game in Japan, and it was some kind of a board game type of deal, like a visual board game. So it's really interesting to see that when you look at the launch lineups in a console, usually they'll try to have like a fighting game, a racing game, a little bit for everybody, right? Because if Ryan and I are in the same household, we may both be gamers, but that doesn't mean we play the same game. Yet here, Nintendo just said, look, if you don't like Super Mario 64, we got ourselves a problem. Like, looking back, would you have liked to have them added another genre? And if so, what do you think was missing? Maybe not even necessarily a specific game, but it's like we have platformer. Pilot Wings, you can call it, it's not an adventure game because of the type of game. It's a weird genre, right?
It's a flying game, really. You got to hit those rings. Yeah. You got to hit those rings, and that's all you got. But honestly, I would say that this generation is an exception for me in the way that 2D to 3D is arguably one of the biggest jumps in video game technology. And the fact that it took a little longer for everybody to catch up, and the launch of the Nintendo 64 suffered for it. Like, I think this is an instance where people get a pass for that one, just because of how significantly the industry was moving forward with that one. But hypothetically, if I were to add something, I would add something like a fighting game to that, just because I'm not going to call it a cash grab, but there were so many big fighting game franchises that they could have leaned on. And I mean, really, later on in the N64's lifetime, they leaned on all of the Mortal Kombats, the Killer Instincts, the Clay Fighters of the world. That would have been something that would have added at least that name value to beyond Nintendo to the N64 lineup that it was missing.
Just to piggyback off of what Keith was saying, I do think a little bit of variety would have helped, but again, Mario 64 was such a revolutionary game that it really was carrying it, and I think because at this point, the PlayStation's already been out and they just need to get the system out. They couldn't really wait any longer. So they were their hands were kind of tied in this situation. But I think having a sports game or another, like, a racing game, because Pilot Wings wasn't really a racing game, either of those could have really helped kind of pad out a little bit more variety.
I think, and it's interesting because it's relevant now. I would have loved like a cruising game because, like, I love me those cruising games like Cruising World, Cruising USA. Now they just came out with a new one that's out on Switch, which is just like super odd to think about. But Keith, you brought up an amazing point there that I never thought about, which is, what if Nintendo by design said, look, we've seen our fair share of bad 3D games. And I mean, launch lineups usually are cluttered with them. So maybe Nintendo
look at
said
the PlayStation 1.
Yeah, exactly. So perhaps Nintendo speculated and said, look, let's direct the attention to the thing we know works. Because that way, if people get a really good first impression, then that paves the way for other games. Versus imagine they came out with like 10 games and 9 of them were crappy 3D games, and you'd be thinking to yourself, oh man, maybe 2D is still like the way to go, which I'd actually like to go back because Super Nintendo games were still coming out here. It's not like they discontinued that. So
you might argue that 2D was still majority of the way to go in 1996.
And we just picked a couple of different games that came out around this time and after. Okay, so some of these came out after the launch of the N64. The first one I got to bring up here to this day, I think it was Modern Vintage Gamer. There was some channel on YouTube that did a great job talking about this game. It's Street Fighter Alpha 2. So for context, this game also came out on PS1. So I'm talking about Street Fighter Alpha 2 on the Super freaking Nintendo. I always thought this was a ROM hack because the game should not run on a Super Nintendo. It's laggy, it's buggy, it's slow, but think about the fact that you have Street Fighter 2 and Alpha 2 also both in the same console. Did you guys even know this one came out for that, considering it was a very popular arcade game?
I used to play the heck out of the Super Nintendo version of that game. I owned a copy of it, actually, and I would bring it over to my friends.
That's like super rare now.
It is. I know. I wish I still had it somewhere. But yeah, this was probably my favorite version of Street Fighter growing up. Like, you know how everybody that's dabbled in fighting games at some point has their Street Fighter? This was mine.
What about you, Ryan?
Yeah, I didn't know that existed. I'm not someone who's really up to speed on a lot of the Street Fighter games. I know there's so many versions of Street Fighter 2. I just remember whatever the first version of Street Fighter 2 was on Super Nintendo. I had no idea that a game that was also on PlayStation was also running on a Super Nintendo, which is pretty impressive.
It always begs the question.
This was my first foray into Akuma. Everybody remembers their first.
That's true. And I'm not going to go to the last part. It kind of goes back to the conversation where in the PS2, once we got to the very end of the generation, that's when God of War 1 and 2 came out. And it let you know, hey, like these developers, they can squeeze out some juice out of these consoles. So it'd be interesting to see like if developers kept developing at that time, because we still have Super Nintendo games that are coming out now, right? But it's more with that nostalgic vibe. So other games that also came out around that time, NBA Live 97, FIFA Soccer, Terranigma, NBA Hang Time, and last and definitely not least, especially for this list, Donkey Kong Country 3. I was blown away because I always just assumed it was Super Nintendo, here's the main lineup, N64 came out, and yeah, the sports games, I don't think anybody's surprised. Like, we kept getting Tony Hawk games, like those are the transitional games for generations, but, you know, taking it to you, Ryan, being the huge DKC fan, did you play this one after the N64 came out? Like, talk to me about that.
I did, because I didn't get an N64 right away. I probably didn't get it until the following Christmas. So this game came out, basically I think in December of 1996 or November, sometime around the holiday season. And I remember I asked for it for Christmas, and my dad wasn't able to get it. Like, they were sold out wherever he looked, but he was able to rent it for me on Christmas. So I was able to play the game, and then later on we were able to get it. But I did play through it back then, and I kind of love the little Easter egg in the game. If you go into one of the areas where you save, the Wrinkly Kong is the character. She's like the grandmother Kong, but she's playing N64 sometimes when you go in there, and you can hear like the Mario Castle music in just like Super Nintendo version.
I did not know that existed. That's awesome. But yeah, how must that feel for that Wrinkly Kong can play the thing that you can't?
Yeah, exactly. You don't have it.
Well, you know, I had some friends that had the N64, so it's like whenever you went to their house, you got to play it and got, you know, a feel for it, and you're just like, oh, I can't wait to get my own. But it's like I already recognized the music because I had played Super Mario 64 at a friend's house by then. So it was really cool Easter egg to kind of get you hyped up for the N64, and a little commercial, I guess, for anyone that was still playing Super Nintendo at that time.
That's kind of crazy to think about, and especially because there's Donkey Kong Country 3. I know people still talk about that, you know, with like they didn't love the I forget Kiddy Kong, is it? What's his name?
Yeah, it was Kiddy Kong. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. But it's still like a main Nintendo game, right? And consider the fact that the Nintendo 64 was delayed. So in another timeline, what would this have looked like? Like, as I'm talking about this, it's like this console should have come out like a year before. So what do you think we would have ever gotten DKC3 were that be the case? Because I don't think so.
Yeah, so I mean, some of these projects might not have been may not have gotten the green light, essentially, if they knew N64 was going to come out a year prior, or they would have just developed it for the N64. And I do think that a game like Donkey Kong Country, which had such a unique like graphic style to it, if they tried to just do basic 3D graphics, but even maybe still be a 2D platformer, it probably would have looked like garbage by today's standards. So thankfully, It came out on the Super Nintendo, where even to this day, those graphics look phenomenal.
It is an interesting train of thought, just because game development was so different in those days, and a game dev cycle wasn't 2 or 3 or even 4 or 5 years in the making, right? Like, these sequels are coming out a year later, sometimes even less. So if the N64 did come out earlier, you might not see these games. They might have taken things from Donkey Kong Country 3 and maybe just like folded them into Donkey Kong 64, but I don't think that game would have ever seen the light of day.
Yeah, it's amazing to think they cranked out DKC 1, 2, and 3, all, 94, 95, 96.
That's
like,
insane
boom.
to think
Yeah.
about.
There's
It's
a
just
reason
so
Rare
different.
has that pedigree from people.
Oh, yeah.
And then
And then
unfortunately,
they had 64. Womp womp.
yeah, I know you've said that you've enjoyed that game, Ryan. We'll talk about that in the future, but I just can't get into like the 3D Donkey Kong.
Oh, Donkey Kong 64? Oh, no, it's a very flawed game. Rare had much better N64 games that we will get to.
I will go on record here and say that the only productive thing Donkey Kong 64 gave society was the DK rap.
I'm not gonna
It's a
argue.
beautiful piece of music.
Lanky Kong, man. Lanky Kong.
No, just the DK rap. Because he's finally here
DK.
and he's coming for you.
Donkey Kong. No, we get like copyright. I don't know. Anyway, people. So this lovely console was initially going to be $250. It's going to be $250, and then they chopped it down. So between one thing and another, let's say it was $270, right? An average price point between the console and a game of choice. And what's interesting here, we pulled up some information because there can be a lot of people here that this is going to make me feel, I know there's a lot of people listening to this that did not grow up with a Nintendo 64, GameCube, or I'm even going to say Wii, right? It's a little painful. But here's some data coming to us from Business Wire. During the system's first 3 days in the market, the retailer sold 350,000 consoles of the 500,000 available console units. During its first 4 months, the console yielded 500,000 unit sales in North America. Nintendo successfully outsold Sony and Sega early 1997 in the United States, and by the end of its first full year, 3.6 million units were sold in the United States. So, for context, once again, the PS1 has already been out. So it's not this case of one console came out in 2 months, you get the other one. We're talking about quite the wide margin. Yet despite that, kind of like how the original Xbox struggled a little bit, the PlayStation was still the new kid on the block. Sega already had, itself established with the Master System and everything else. So this 3D console comes in and kind of just like blazes through the other stuff, considering the fact it had 2 freaking launch games, right?
Yeah. I hope Nintendo has a good benefit plan, because Mario's going to need to see a chiropractor after carrying that launch on his back.
Yeah, right? It's kind of crazy to think about.
I mean, I think with how successful the Super Nintendo was, a lot of people might have been holding out and waiting for that next Nintendo console. I mean, I know I was. PlayStation wasn't even on my radar at this point in time. I'm not sure if a lot of kids were in the same place, but I wish there was like a poll, but back then I'm sure they didn't take numbers of like kids who had a Sega, did they jump to PlayStation? Because we know like
no, they were busy being
Saturn
burned by
everything.
the Master System and the Saturn.
Yeah, we know the Saturn didn't exactly have the most successful run, right? So did Sega? It's like, did kids who have a Sega jump to PlayStation, and kids who had Super Nintendo jump to N64? Or what was that? I'd love to know if that information's out there, but I don't think people were really that deep into video game journalism at that time. But it makes sense. I think that early on, N64 sales were outpacing, at least during these months, the PlayStation, just because this is now the new thing, the hot new thing out. So they kind of had that momentum for those through the holidays.
And I think what's always going to be interesting about this shift, it's like from N64, PlayStation 1 generation forward, yeah, there's always the new thing, but we got into 3D, right? We're not in 4D or something like that. We eventually got to VR. So this was like the last significant shift. I guess the other one would be from PS2 to PS3 in terms of like high definition, right? Because we just keep going up in that.
Maybe 480 to 1080 is the last big one, but even then, that's not even close to 2D versus 3D.
Because it's literally another dimension, right? It's not just a gimmick or something like that.
You have entered the next dimension.
We literally did, dude. It's freaking mind-blowing. And then as a kid, I really, at least here in Puerto Rico, we didn't have like, or at least where I lived, if I'd go to KB Toys, it was Nintendo and Sony. Sega maybe had like, I'm going to say a microscopic corner, but I really didn't come to play any Sega console until the Dreamcast because I barely knew about it. In your case, like going back to 96, if you would go to a game store, there's the N64, hot and spicy. What else was there? Was there a conversation about like the Jaguar or anything else that came out in those few years?
I had no idea the Jaguar existed until Angry Video Game Nerd. I'll be completely honest. And the Saturn, I remember hearing about the Saturn, and I maybe played it once at some like random kid's house.
The Jaguar, by the way, came out in 93, just for those wondering.
Yeah, and I think Sega kind of confused me as a kid because I knew about Genesis. I was very familiar with like Super Nintendo versus Sega Genesis. But then I heard about like Sega CD, and I thought that was like a new console. I didn't understand what that was. And then Sega Saturn came out, and I was like, is Sega Saturn Sega CD? Like I didn't know as a kid. Like they had all this stuff coming out that I wasn't able to make sense of it. And then yeah, really the next thing after Genesis that Sega really stood out to me was the Dreamcast, because that's where they really kind of made a real second mark after the Genesis. But most of the time when I went to game stores, it was around the N64 time. I was paying attention to Nintendo 64 and PlayStation and very little else.
Yeah, it was the same thing for me. This was a point in time where Sega had kind of been pushed to the side by the rest of the industry because, yeah, there were some places that were still selling a lot of Genesis games, but those were like the older games, the old generation, where you would find in like the bargain bins or significantly cheaper than the new consoles, the new generations. And then it was very, very much just PlayStation and N64 up until 1999 when the Dreamcast kind of was like the second wind of the Sega consoles. But as far as 1996 goes, they were very much not a factor.
And just some more interesting information. So the PS1 launched before that, but it was $300. So we're talking about $100 less. So strategically, we're saying that for less than $300, with or without tax, you get the N64 and you get the game, right? And another curious fact is the Sega Saturn came out in 94, but that price point, what did you guys think? I forgot if I said this in the previous episode. I'm just going to make it fun, though. What was the launch price for the Saturn? No Googling. What did you think that launch price was?
Wasn't it insane?
I'm going to say $299.
$299? What do you got?
$400.
Keith actually got it right, $399. So
wow. I remember it being like a boutique item that it was like the Neo Geo in the way that it was just way too expensive for anybody.
Like, let's just think about that. Give or take 2 years before the N64, there was a console that is double the price. And then Nintendo says, hey, I'm giving you 2 games, but you got the Mario, you got the video game comfort food. It's literally half the price. I mean, and then you got the PS1 in the middle. You can kind of, from a consumer standpoint, it's pretty easy to see now with hindsight, like, oh, so this is why these 2 consoles dominated the market, right?
Mm-hmm. This is going to make some people very, very mad, but the PlayStation at that time was basically just a better, more economically friendly Saturn. Like, there was really no reason to think of, especially after it was released, to think about the Saturn when you had the PlayStation, which was cheaper, had a promising library of games around the corner, and just had more legs than the Saturn did. Like the lifespan of that was just very short and kind of never really got out of the gate because of how expensive they made it. It was a very bad choice.
Yeah, because you have to think that nowadays you can get away with a video game console priced at $400, right?
There's $3,000 phones, so
yeah, and the reason because of that is because we grew up and now we have money to spend and we're willing to spend that on video games.
And Pokemon
but back
cards.
then, convincing like my parents to get me a $400 video game console,
they would have
like,
laughed at me and probably whooped my ass.
yeah.
yeah, like that's just not happening. But now, us being older, still playing video games, eventually you have kids, you understand it. You might be willing to pay that not only for your kid, but hey, you get to play it too. So nowadays you can get away with that, but I can see why they got completely burnt, because they were maybe ambitious with the technology, but if you had that price point too high, then you're just not going to have any customers.
Absolutely. And so we are going to talk about our first experience with the N64 and a little bit more about Super Mario 64, because it's just like the game. But something that was quite interesting is, once again, September 29th, 1996 for North America. However, in Europe, it actually came out March 1st, 1997. So not a full year afterwards, but it was the next year. And when you look at the launch lineup, there's not a lot more, but there's two games that make me think, man, like, if you would have lumped up these two games with like Super Mario and Pilot Wings, like that would have been pretty badass. So the launch lineup for Europe was FIFA Soccer 64, Pilot Wings 64, Super Mario 64, a lot of 64s, but then we have Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, Turok Dinosaur Hunter, and Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey. So obviously, I'm talking about FIFA and Wayne. No, you have Star Wars
Wayne
and Turok.
Gretzky's 3D Hockey was not bad.
I think
as
I
a
rented
Canadian, I
As
had
a Canadian,
to try it.
It was a pack-in title in Canada.
Exactly. In fact, Wayne Gretzky came to your door and he's like, "Here you go, bud."
So Keith, talk to me about Shadows of the Empire. I assume you've played that.
Actually, I haven't. I've played the one level that everybody else has played, the Hoth one, that was mind-blowing, and then I haven't played it beyond that. But I've heard nothing but great things, and this is what I'm talking about. I think this and Turok are great examples of just other companies not being quite ready for 3D and just needing a little more time in the oven to get it right. And they had that extra 6 months between the US and the European launch to get it right and to get it out there. And it really shows just like how much, like how ready they were for something like that. And it might lead you to argue that maybe the launch should have been delayed another 6 months to have all of those games come out in North America at the same time and it not just be the Super Mario 64 show.
Because for context, Star Wars Shadows of the Empire is a third-person shooter, and Turok is a first-person shooter, which, as of this recording, it's still being re-released today, right? Like, Limited Run has physical copies, so I think it's a fairly popular game to this day. What do you think about this launch lineup, Brian?
Obviously, a lot stronger and more well-rounded. I think this is the launch that I'm sure that they wish they had. I think this is a very fair lineup, and it kind of all the pieces are there for a nice launch set of games. And yeah, Shadows of the Empire is a game I remember hearing about and like kids talking about it, and I still have never played that game. So I don't know, maybe someday I will.
Everybody
have to visit
needs
it.
to check out the Hoth level. After that, I don't know what's in that game. It's probably pretty good, but that Hoth level, though.
I think people just associate Star Wars and N64 and just go to Racer. At least that's definitely the case for me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, There's a lot of good Star Wars games. We could do like a series of episodes in Star Wars. I know Keith would not complain about Star Wars game coverage. So
Yeah, I'd love to cover something like Knights of the Old Republic one day.
Hey, they announced the remake, so who knows? Anything's possible. Before Keith punches me in the face. So, September, right? My first experience with the N64, I'm 100% sure, at least 99.8%, that the first time that I played it was via rental at Blockbuster in Christmas. Because I had a PS1, but everybody was talking about Mario. So I think it was like a Christmas gift. Like, we didn't have enough money to actually buy the console. But I remember looking at the cartridge when they were packing everything up and then just putting in the cartridge in the console, kind of like the Super Nintendo, was just so satisfying. And then the freaking controller. We talked a little bit about that on the previous episode, but I just didn't know how to hold it. I didn't get it, right? It's like, okay, Mario's a 3D game, so I guess this is how you hold it, but then I'm accustomed to holding the D-pad, which is on the left. So having said that, talk to me, let's start with Keith. Talk to me about that first experience that you had with an N64, from holding the controller to the game.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember where exactly it was. I was just trying to search the name of the store that it was in, but I remember it was in a yellow kiosk, and they had like Super Mario 64 playing in it. And then I think you had to like put money into it or something, and you could play like 10, 15 minutes of Super Mario 64 for $1.
Kind of like hotel rooms. Hotel rooms had that for a while.
Kind of, yeah. Much like this hotel room I stayed in like 2008 that still wanted to charge me for a Nintendo 64. That's another story for another day. But regardless, I remember holding that controller for the first time and not really being able to wrap my head around it. Like, I think I tried to use the C buttons to get Mario to move at first, and it just wasn't working. And it was very hard to wrap my head around the trident at first. Eventually, you get used to it, and it starts to make sense. But it was very compared to the Super Nintendo controller that I was used to, it was very much like a next level thing. Like, it was a step well above in complexity.
So although I didn't get the Super Nintendo until late 97, I think. I had, you have friends, and luckily some of your friends are a little more their family's a little more well off than you, so they had a Super Nintendo. So I feel like everyone had that friend that had all the games, but so we would go over to his house and play Super Mario. I'm sure that's where, if I didn't play it at a game
Nintendo
store,
or N64. I'm getting confused
I'm sorry,
now.
N64.
Yeah, I was going to say,
we did play Super Nintendo,
hack.
but obviously when the N64 came out,
Yeah.
that's what it was all about. So if I didn't play it at some random toy store or game store, then I probably played it at a friend's house and played some Mario 64. I was definitely blown away by the game, and I was I had seen quite a few different games by the time I finally got my hands on a Nintendo 64, so I had a pretty good idea of what games I wanted to get by the time I was able to get one.
It was a store in Winnipeg called Pictures, Frames, and More. And there was also a corner of it that also had a wrestling store in it called Jabroni's.
That's amazing.
I needed to get that out there. It was Jabroni's Hardcore Wrestling Store. Shout out to Joe Aiello. Continue.
Never forget, man. Never forget. But yeah, that was a pretty amazing experience for me. I remember, even though I had played 3D games because I had a PS1, by that point I had played Battle Arena to Shinden, Destruction Derby, but I'm not going to sit here and say I got 3D gaming, right? It's like, I guess it's the next step. And then I played maybe 3 seconds. I think we all recall our first time. You see a pipe, going up from the ground. Mario jumps out. There's no music. There's nothing, right? You kind of just get some text, but then you're kind of just left there thinking, what do you do? And then that's when you realize, oh, I don't even need to go to the castle. Like, I must have spent easily 40 minutes just outside being mind blown over just, climbing the trees, understanding the backflips, like how fluid the animation was, because right now, I'm playing through a couple of games on PS3, PlayStation 3, couple generations after. And when I go back to some of these games, you feel the clunkiness with like the ragdoll physics and all that. But then you go back with Super Mario 64, and it's like, what the hell? Like, what is this advanced tech that you do nothing in the game, and it just feels so fluid, so beautiful when you backflip. It's just like freaking glorious. Damn it, I don't even have a question. I just need
it's
somebody
very
to validate
satisfying to control Mario, because I recently replayed it when the 3D All-Stars came out for the Switch, and I, for the first time in my life, got the all 120 stars in Mario 64. I'd actually never done that before. And there's a reason people still play it and speedrun it all the time, is because Mario's movement is so incredible for a game. For being one of the first 3D platformers, it's incredible how like momentum matters, the variety of moves, like your long jumps and the dives into, you know, you dive and you can jump up again. If you do it fast enough, then you don't like lose speed when you do it. There's so much nuance to Mario's movements. And if you watch some of these speed runs, you can see what basically taking Mario's movements to the next level looks like. The amount that there is to be done with just like how amazingly they basically built the foundation of that game, is the fact that you can be so precise and do all these crazy things. And it's really fun. And it's what made that game so amazing, is because if you knew how to move well with Mario, you could basically solve stars way easier than even like the main way you're supposed to solve them, because if you were good at wall jumping and doing all these certain jumps. So it's just like they created a really fun character control and then just gave you this amazing playground to control him in. So yeah, it's just incredible.
Yeah, it's no accident that this is one of the most revered games of all time, for that exact reason that Ryan mentioned. Because with that added third dimension in these games, like, it was really one of the first games where you were able to almost like break the level just by being able to control it better. Like, you could figure out those ways to almost cheat just by moving and timing your jumps right, and maybe skipping a section or making this section easier than it was supposed to be. It's not something you could really do too much in 2D platformers, because you were always kind of limited by the length of the level and how far you were able to move in it. But now all of a sudden, when you've got this three-dimensional playground and these precise controls and things that can link together like Super Mario 64 has, like, like I said, there's no accident that it is as good as it is, just having all of those factors together.
And I was just watching a video from GameSack, and the topic, it was 2D games that failed to make a really healthy transition to 3D. Like, maybe the sequels eventually got better, but it's like that shift. And he had talked about Earthworm Gym. Earthworm Gym is like a very beautiful 2D game, right? But with 2D games, more often than not, with the exception of, I guess, something like Super Metroid, there's not a lot of adventure in a platforming game. It's very much get to this checkpoint, right? Cross this thing. It's from point A to from point A to point B. But when you go to 3D, a lot of that gets taken away because it's more about the experience, right? It's like, here's a sandbox and you got to get to this point, but you can spend 20 minutes doing nothing. And as you guys mentioned, the most mind-blowing thing for Mario 64 for me was, hey, you can technically follow the traditional route, but if you get really good at momentum, you can skip half the levels, you can skip a lot of stuff, and it's not with mods, right? Like, people have exploited the game, but it's a lot of things that put yourself in the developer's shoes. Like, this is the first mainstream, like, top-notch AAA platformer, right, that people remember. And I remember, like, a couple years later, even in the N64, a lot of companies just could not match it. And whether you like Nintendo as a business or not, you know, Nintendo's historically, they freaking added Bluetooth on the Switch. It was there the whole time. It was there the whole freaking time. It's just like, they didn't flip the damn Switch, guys.
It's like, hey guys, do you know we could do this? No? Oh, we can?
People already
Okay.
$40 on accessories.
As brilliant as Nintendo could be sometimes the most obvious things they just totally miss. And that's the thing is the kind of the 3D collectathon, what kind of became the blueprint for 3D platformers, was not even the original plan. With Mario 64, their original idea was to have it be like Super Mario World, where you had a bunch of levels that you had to get through. But they realized when they started making the levels that, we're not going to be able to create like 50 different levels. So they ended up saying like, okay, how can we make the most out of each of the levels that we're making? And that's where they came up with the idea of having objectives instead of having, 50 different levels that you just go from start to the end.
Yeah, so overall, it's when you think about the launch of the N64, at least for me, and then I'll take it over to you guys, even though it's the most limited launch lineup we've ever seen in a console and probably ever will, it's arguably the perfect launch lineup because whenever you leap into a new generation, I think we've all been bummed out. Like, what are some of the complaints people have said about the PS5 and the Series X when they came out, right? Especially because of COVID and all that. But generally speaking, it's like, oh, so I'm getting the new console to essentially play my older games in better performance, but where's that leap? And even now, people are still saying, okay, this looks a little bit better. Where's that leap? And Nintendo just said, look, here it is. You want the leap. You don't got to get 5 games. You don't got to wait 2 years. Here it is. Once you got that, it's like, okay, hey, Nintendo, once you have the other games that come out, I mean, we eventually got stuff like Smash, which even though it's 2D, it does show like what you can do in that 3D environment. But at least for me, and we'll be talking about this 2 episodes down the line, by the way, the legacy of the N64. But at least for me, the launch lineup is less is more, and I don't think you could do it any better with the game that we got. What about you guys?
Nintendo is really good at just having that one game that they use to sell a system, whether it be Super Mario World, Super Mario 64, Wii Sports, Breath of the Wild. They always make sure that they have, whether they succeed or fail, they have that one thing that really like drives the system home. And I think this is
what did the Wii U have?
Well, that's one of the times that they failed. Nintendo Land didn't exactly hit the mark.
Yeah.
But
exactly, case in point. In point. Yep.
It's just, I think that Super Mario 64 is one of, if not the best example of Nintendo having that one thing to really prove why you need this new thing.
Yeah, I would say the only downside was that obviously there's some gamers out there where Mario 64, that type of game just isn't their style. And for that, they had no reason to get a Nintendo 64 for quite a while. And maybe that's why PlayStation, there was a lot more people kind of jumping to PlayStation. But I think for most gamers that appreciated that platformer style, then they were more than satisfied with the incredible game that Mario 64 was.
Yeah, so for everybody listening, you can definitely let us know what you think about the launch lineup, like Super Mario 64. You can head over to on Twitter, Quest Rewind, same thing on Facebook. If you're listening to us on podcast apps, the link to our Discord is available right there. And while you're at that, if you enjoy the podcast, that 5-star review really does help out. We try to have this carefully curated series where right now we are publishing 5 episodes for the N64. The first one talked about the birth. Now we have the launch. Now the next episode, people, it's going to be about the games that came out within the first 12 years of the N64.
So first 12 months.
First 12 years, man.
My goodness. And we're going to talk about every single Nintendo 64 game
Games
ever.
are still coming out to this day, people. They're still coming out. 12 months of the N64. 12 friggin' years. Hey, the Game Boy lasted a long time.
That's
true.
Yeah, true.
I think I lost it though. But anyway, so that is over there on the Discord if you want to join that conversation. But after the next episode, which is the first 12 months, Then we'll be publishing an episode about the legacy of the N64. So after those 12 years, after the console expired, what do we really think about the console as a whole? And then on episode 5, people, we are going to be reviewing one specific game from that initial library. Mr. McNulty, Ryan, do me the honors. What is the game that we'll be talking about?
That will be a game I've actually never played more than a few minutes of, and that is Star Fox 64. So I'm looking forward to finally getting my hands on that game. I don't.
That's Keith, just for those in the audio version.
I don't know if that impression's landing right now.
Yeah. But everybody that's going to be doing it for this episode, hopefully everybody's been enjoying it. And as we mentioned, it's we're going to be publishing episodes, taking a bit of a break as we plan out the future ones. So whether it be a console, a genre, like, hey, I set out an idea there. What if we could do 5 episodes on something related to Star Wars video games or a particular year in a video game? So the box is open. It's up to all of you to fill it in with some of that video game goodness. So up until next time, this has been another edition of Quest Rewind. Take care, everybody.